I worked 80 hours a week for 5 years to pay off the mortgage early. When I finally did it, my husband smiled and said, "Great. Now I can divorce you without losing the house." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I smiled back and handed him the mail. He looked confused at first. Then I watched the color drain from his face as he opened the envelope. That moment lasted only a few seconds, but it rewrote our entire marriage. That night, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. 29 missed calls. Voicemails, texts, silence, then more calls. Just hours earlier, he had been so confident, so certain, so sure that all my sacrifices had cornered me, not him. What he didn't know was that while I was working myself to exhaustion, I was also learning about paperwork, about ownership, about the quiet power of understanding the law before someone tries to use it against you. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about survival and the moment a woman realizes she no longer has to beg to be treated fairly. Before the mortgage, before the overtime, before the quiet resentment that settled into our walls like dust no one wanted to clean, there was a version of my life where I genuinely believed I was building something strong. Ethan and I met 8 years ago in Cedar Falls, a town that prides itself on tradition. The kind of place where people still believe marriage is forever, and hard work always leads to stability. He stood out immediately not because he was loud or flashy, but because he was calm, composed, confident without raising his voice. When he spoke, people leaned in. When he smiled, it felt deliberate, practiced, like he knew exactly what effect it had. I was drawn to that certainty. At the time, my life was anything but certain. I was working 2 jobs, one full-time position in operations, another part-time role on weekends, trying to recover from years of financial instability. I paid my bills on time, tracked every expense, and carried a quiet fear of falling behind. Ethan noticed my discipline and praised it often. "You're impressive, Olivia," he told me early on. "Most people talk about goals. You actually follow through." Those words meant more to me than I admitted. I had spent so long being self-reliant that being seen felt like relief. We moved quickly. Dinners turned into weekends together. Weekends turned into him leaving clothes at my apartment. Within a year, we were sharing a lease. Ethan talked often about the future, but always in broad strokes. He liked the idea of security, of stability, of a life that looked orderly and respectable. He didn't talk much about effort or sacrifice. I didn't notice that gap then. I assumed it was understood. When money came up, our approaches couldn't have been more different. I planned, budgeted, prepared for emergencies that hadn't happened yet. Ethan brushed those conversations aside. "Why stress about things that might never happen?" he'd say, smiling. "We'll figure it out if they do." What he meant, I would later realize, was that I would. Still, I ignored the unease. Love has a way of softening warnings until they sound like background noise. When Ethan proposed, it felt less like a dramatic moment and more like the natural next step. We didn't argue about the wedding, mostly because I quietly adjusted my expectations. Smaller guest list. Fewer extras. I paid more than I should have, but I told myself marriage was an investment. Looking back, that was the first time I confused commitment with endurance. The early years of our marriage were calm on the surface. We worked, ate dinner together most nights, hosted friends occasionally, but there was a pattern I couldn't quite name yet. Whenever something needed to be handled, paperwork, scheduling, financial planning, it landed on me. Ethan framed it as trust. "You're just better at this stuff," he'd say. "I don't worry because you've got it covered." I wanted to believe that made me valued. The idea of buying a house came from him. He talked about it like a milestone we needed to hit, a box to check. Ownership, equity, stability. I hesitated, knowing what the responsibility would mean, but Ethan reassured me with confidence that sounded like support. "We're a team," he said. "This is for us." When we met with the loan officer, the reality was less romantic. My credit history was solid. Ethan's was complicated. Old accounts, unpaid balances, mistakes he preferred not to discuss. The conclusion was simple. The mortgage would need to be in my name alone. I remember pausing, glancing at Ethan, waiting for hesitation or discomfort. Instead, he squeezed my hand and laughed softly. "It's just a technicality," he said. "A name on paper doesn't define a marriage." I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe it. We bought the house anyway, a modest place with 3 bedrooms, a long driveway, and a small backyard that Ethan talked about turning into an entertainment space someday. I stood in the empty living room on move-in day, keys heavy in my palm, feeling proud and terrified at the same time. This was the biggest commitment of my life. Ethan wrapped his arm around me and kissed my temple. "You did this," he whispered. "You're incredible." I didn't hear the unspoken part. "You're responsible." At first, owning the house felt empowering. I painted walls on weekends, fixed small things myself, paid the bills early. Ethan enjoyed the benefits without much interest in the logistics. If I brought up the mortgage, he'd nod vaguely. If I mentioned interest rates or timelines, his eyes glazed over. "You worry too much," he'd say. "We've got plenty of time." But time was the one thing I couldn't stop calculating. I started running numbers late at night, long after Ethan had gone to bed. 30 years, interest nearly doubling the cost of the house, payments stretching into retirement. The idea made my chest tighten. I didn't want to be trapped by debt forever. I wanted freedom, security, control over my future. When I finally told Ethan I was thinking about paying off the mortgage early, he didn't react the way I expected. He looked surprised, then cautious. "That sounds intense," he said. "What about enjoying life?" I explained it carefully. Extra hours, temporary sacrifice, long-term gain. I told him how good it would feel to own our home outright, how much pressure it would remove. He listened quietly, then smiled. "If that's what you want," he said, "I trust you." I mistook that for support. What I didn't see yet was how comfortable he was letting me carry the weight. How easily he stepped back while I stepped forward. How the house, from the very beginning, was never just a home to him. It was leverage. And without realizing it, I had already started a 5-year journey that would cost me more than time or money. It would test my health, my sense of self, and my understanding of what love actually looks like when it's stripped of convenience. At the time, though, all I saw was a goal. Pay off the house, secure our future, prove that sacrifice leads to safety. I didn't know yet that safety in the wrong hands can be turned into a weapon. The decision to work 80 hours a week didn't happen all at once. It began quietly, almost reasonably, the way life-changing choices often do. At first, it was just a few extra shifts, a project that needed oversight, a supervisor who noticed my reliability and asked if I could help out a little longer. I said yes because I always said yes, because saying yes felt productive, responsible, temporary. I told myself it wouldn't last long. A year, maybe 2. Enough to make a visible dent in the mortgage, enough to feel momentum. Ethan didn't protest. That should have mattered more to me. When I explained my plan in detail, how I'd take on overtime, how I'd apply for a higher-paying role, how every extra dollar would go straight to the principal, he listened with his usual calm expression. No enthusiasm, no concern, just quiet acceptance. "If that's what you want," he said again, "I'll support you." Support, I would later realize, meant not getting in the way. The first few months were exhausting but manageable. I woke up before sunrise, worked through lunch, and came home after dark. On weekends, I traded rest for extra income. My body adjusted reluctantly. My social life disappeared completely. Friends stopped inviting me out because I always declined. Ethan noticed the changes, but only when they affected him. "You're never home anymore," he said one night, half joking, half annoyed. "I'm doing this for us," I reminded him gently. He nodded, kissed my cheek, and went back to his phone. At home, our routines shifted without discussion. I paid every bill. I tracked every payment. I handled repairs, insurance, taxes. Ethan continued living as if nothing had changed, same spending habits, same relaxed attitude. If I asked him to cut back on something, he'd raise an eyebrow. "You're the one choosing to work this much," he'd say. "Don't punish me for it." I started sleeping less, eating poorly, carrying constant tension in my shoulders. Still, every time I logged into the mortgage account and saw the balance drop, it felt worth it. Progress was addictive. Control was comforting. The compliments from work didn't hurt either. Promotions came quickly. Raises followed. People admired my discipline, my dedication. "You're unstoppable," a colleague once said. At home, though, that word felt ironic. Ethan grew distant in subtle ways. He stopped asking about my day, stopped waiting up for me. If I came home late, dinner was already done sometimes without a plate left for me. When I mentioned feeling tired, he'd sigh. You chose this, he reminded me. Remember? It was true. I had chosen it. Or at least, I thought I had. Years passed like that. One became two, two became three. The mortgage shrank faster than anyone expected. I kept telling myself I was almost there, that the finish line was close, that once the house was paid off, everything would slow down again. Ethan never asked when I planned to stop. By the fourth year, the strain showed in ways I could no longer ignore. My health declined, my patience thinned. I started feeling like a guest in my own home, one who paid for everything but belonged nowhere. When I tried to talk about it, Ethan deflected. You're being dramatic, he said once. Things are fine. Fine, I learned, is a word people use when they don't want to look too closely. I began noticing things that unsettled me. Ethan asking questions about legal ownership, casually mentioning divorce laws in conversations that had nothing to do with us, always joking about how complicated separations could be. Good thing we're solid, he'd add, smiling. I laughed along, uneasy but unwilling to confront the feeling creeping into my chest. In the fifth year, I finally saw the end in sight. The numbers were undeniable. A few more payments, and the mortgage would be gone. Completely. I imagined the relief, the silence of a debt-free life, the freedom I had worked myself into the ground for. I told Ethan we were almost there. That's great, he said without looking up. Really, there was no celebration. No shared excitement, just a strange distance I couldn't name yet. When the final payment went through, I sat alone at my desk and stared at the confirmation screen. 5 years, thousands of hours, missed holidays, missed sleep, missed versions of myself I would never get back. I expected tears, or joy, or something. What I felt instead was clarity. That night, I told Ethan the house was officially paid off. He smiled in a way I had never seen before. Not warm, not proud, calculated. Well, he said lightly, that worked out perfectly. I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. I went to bed that night believing I had secured our future, believing the hardest part was over, believing that sacrifice, once again, had led to safety. I didn't know that Ethan had been waiting for this exact moment. And I had no idea that the next day, with a single sentence, he would reveal that my greatest achievement was never shared. It was studied, anticipated, and quietly prepared against. The day the house was officially paid off didn't feel the way I had imagined for 5 years. There was no celebration, no champagne, no quiet moment of relief shared between two people who had survived something hard together. Instead, there was just an ordinary Tuesday evening and the sound of Ethan setting his keys down on the counter like nothing monumental had happened. I had printed the confirmation letter from the bank and placed it neatly on the dining table. It felt real that way, ink on paper. Proof that the debt was gone. Proof that I had done it. It's official, I said when Ethan walked in. The mortgage is paid in full. He stopped for a moment, just a moment. Then he smiled, but it wasn't the smile I expected. Well, he said casually, loosening his tie, that worked out perfectly. I frowned. What do you mean? He shrugged, poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter like we were discussing the weather. I mean, timing-wise, you really handled that efficiently. Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. I worked myself into the ground for 5 years, I said. Of course I handled it efficiently. He laughed softly. Relax, Olivia. I'm complimenting you. We sat down to dinner, but the air felt different. Heavy. Like something was being held just beneath the surface. Ethan barely touched his food. He watched me instead, his expression thoughtful, almost curious. Finally, he cleared his throat. So, he said, now that the house is paid off, I think it's time we talk about next steps. I looked up. Next steps? He nodded. Yeah, about us. My chest tightened. What about us? Ethan exhaled slowly, like he'd been rehearsing this conversation for a while. I don't think this marriage is working anymore. The words landed quietly, but they echoed in my head. What? I asked. It's not dramatic, he said quickly. It's just practical. We've grown apart. You're always working. I barely see you. This doesn't feel like a partnership anymore. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline that never came. You knew why I was working, I said. You supported it. You said. I supported you, he interrupted. But that doesn't mean I signed up for this forever. My heart was pounding now. So what are you saying? He tilted his head, studying me. I'm saying this feels like the right moment to end things. Cleanly. Cleanly, I repeated. After I paid off the house. He smiled again. That same calculated smile. Exactly, he said. Now I can divorce you without losing the house. For a second, I couldn't breathe. I waited for shock to turn into anger, for my voice to shake, for tears to come. But instead, something else happened. Something calm and cold settled into my chest. You planned this, I said quietly. Ethan didn't deny it. I wouldn't call it planning, he replied. More like patience. Patience. 5 years of missed sleep, 5 years of exhaustion, 5 years of sacrifice, and he called it patience. So all this time, I said slowly, you were just waiting. He shrugged. You wanted to pay it off early. I didn't stop you. You benefited from it. I snapped. And you benefited too, he said smoothly. You own a house outright now. I laughed once, sharp and humorless. No, I said. I paid for a house. You just lived in it. The silence that followed felt dangerous. Ethan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Let's not make this emotional, he said. We can do this the mature way. We'll talk to lawyers. Figure out a fair arrangement. Fair, I repeated again. I stood up and walked to the table. Slowly, deliberately, I picked up the envelope I had placed there earlier, the one he hadn't noticed yet. I agree, I said. We should definitely talk about paperwork. Ethan looked surprised as I slid the envelope across the table toward him. What's this? Mail? I said simply. It came today. He hesitated, then opened it. I watched his expression change in real time. The confidence drained first, then the color. His hands froze mid-page. What is this? He asked, his voice suddenly tight. That, I said calmly, is something I prepared while you were being patient. He flipped through the documents again, faster now. His breathing changed. You went to a lawyer? He asked. Several, I replied. You didn't tell me. I didn't think I needed permission. Ethan stood abruptly. This doesn't mean what you think it means. It means exactly what it says, I answered. Ownership, contribution, documentation, dates, signatures. His jaw tightened. You were planning something behind my back. I met his gaze without flinching. I was protecting myself. The room felt smaller. The power dynamic had shifted, and he could feel it. You think this gives you leverage? He said, his voice rising. You think you can just walk away with everything? I think, I said carefully, that you underestimated me. For the first time since the conversation began, Ethan looked unsettled. This isn't over, he said quietly. No, I agreed. It isn't. That night, I slept in the guest room for the first time in years. My phone was silent when I turned it off. By morning, it wouldn't stop ringing. Calls, messages, voicemails, one after another. By midnight, there were 29 missed calls. And for the first time in 5 years, I realized something important. The house was paid off. But the cost of underestimating me had just begun. I didn't answer the phone. At first, that was a conscious decision. I needed space. I needed silence. I needed a few hours where my nervous system wasn't bracing for another sentence designed to dismantle me. But as the calls kept coming, something else replaced my restraint. Curiosity. Ethan called once. Then twice. Then again. I watched my phone light up on the nightstand while I lay in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, counting my breaths. By the 5th call, he left a voicemail. Olivia, pick up, he said, his voice tight but controlled. We need to talk about this. By the 10th call, the control was slipping. You're misunderstanding the documents, he said in another message. This isn't how it works. By the 15th, frustration had turned sharp. You think you're smarter than everyone now? That's not how marriage works. By the 20th, his voice sounded unfamiliar. Please, he said quietly. Just answer the phone. I rolled onto my side and finally picked it up not to answer, but to check the count. 29 missed calls. I turned the phone face down and closed my eyes. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because of fear, but because my mind wouldn't stop replaying the last 5 years through a new lens. Every comment, every dismissal, every moment he had smiled and let me carry more weight while he observed, waited, calculated. The next morning, I woke up early and made coffee like it was any other day. Ethan was already gone. His side of the closet looked disturbed, like he had left in a hurry. That alone told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't slept either. By noon, the texts started. We need to be reasonable. Let's not involve lawyers unnecessarily. You're blowing this out of proportion. Call me. I didn't respond. Instead, I drove to work and requested a personal day. Then I drove straight to the office of the attorney whose card was still in my wallet, the same one I had consulted months earlier. Quietly, methodically, while Ethan assumed I was just tired. When I sat down across from her, she studied my face for a moment before speaking. "Did he say what you thought he would?" she asked. "Yes," I replied, almost word for word. She nodded, unsurprised. "Then you did the right thing." Hearing that from someone objective felt grounding. Validating. Like the floor beneath me had finally stopped shifting. She explained everything again slowly, clearly. The agreements. The documentation of contributions. The legal protections tied to the mortgage being solely in my name. The timeline that mattered more than intentions ever could. His confidence came from assumption, she said. Not law. That sentence stayed with me. When I returned home later that evening, Ethan was waiting in the living room. Sitting upright. Hands clasped. Trying to look calm. "You couldn't answer your phone?" he asked. "I was busy," I said evenly. "With what?" he snapped. "Protecting myself," I replied, setting my bag down. He stood up abruptly. "You're acting like I attacked you." "You announced you planned to divorce me the moment the house was paid off," I said. "What would you call that?" "I was being honest," he said. "I didn't threaten you." "No," I agreed. "You just revealed your intentions." He paced the room, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand what you've done." "I understand exactly what I've done," I said. "And what you underestimated." He stopped pacing and looked at me, anger flashing across his face. "You went behind my back," he said. "You manipulated the situation." I almost laughed. "For 5 years," I said slowly, "I worked 80 hours a week. I paid every bill. I carried the mortgage. I kept records. I asked questions. I learned the rules." "And you call that manipulation?" "You never told me," he insisted. "I didn't owe you a strategy briefing," I replied. The silence that followed was thick, charged. Ethan's voice dropped. "You think this makes you untouchable?" "No," I said. "I think it makes me prepared." He stared at me, searching for something: hesitation, guilt, fear. He didn't find it. "This isn't how I pictured things going," he muttered. I met his gaze. "Me neither." That night, he slept on the couch. I locked the guest room door not because I was afraid of him physically, but because I needed boundaries. Emotional ones. Legal ones. Personal ones. The calls didn't stop. He called from work. From unknown numbers. Left messages that swung wildly between anger and apology. "I didn't mean it like that. You're overreacting. We can fix this. Don't destroy everything over paperwork." Paperwork. That word again. By the third day, the tone changed completely. "Let's be fair," he said in one voicemail. "You don't want this to get ugly." I saved that message. On the 4th day, his voice cracked. "I made a mistake," he said quietly. "I didn't think you'd do this." It was no correct today. That was the moment it truly hit him. He had believed my silence meant weakness. My exhaustion meant ignorance. My commitment meant compliance. He had mistaken endurance for submission. And now, with every unanswered call, that illusion shattered a little more. When I finally agreed to speak with attorneys present, Ethan arrived looking smaller than I remembered. Less composed, less certain. He spoke carefully, choosing his words like stepping stones across unstable ground. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one explaining. I wasn't the one compensating. I wasn't the one justifying my choices. I listened. And as I listened, I felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Not triumph, not revenge, but relief. The power dynamic had shifted. Not because I raised my voice or made threats, but because I had done the work quietly and consistently long before anyone noticed. That night, as I drove home alone, my phone buzzed one last time. A message from Ethan. I didn't think you'd fight back. I didn't reply. Because the truth was simple. I wasn't fighting back. I was finally standing on ground I had paid for every hour, every sacrifice, every hard-earned lesson, and refusing to be pushed off it. The conference room was colder than I expected. Not physically, emotionally. Ethan sat across from me at the long table, his posture stiff, his jaw tight. His attorney flipped through a stack of papers with forced confidence, the kind that comes from realizing too late that the narrative you prepared no longer fits the facts. My attorney sat beside me, calm and unhurried. She didn't need to project authority. The documents already did that for her. This was the first time Ethan had seen the full picture laid out in front of him. Dates, transfers, mortgage statements, employment records, overtime logs, bank accounts, legal language that stripped emotion out of the equation and replaced it with evidence. He shifted in his chair. "I don't understand why we're making this so complicated," Ethan said. "We're married. We built this life together." My attorney didn't respond immediately. She let the silence do its work. "Marriage doesn't erase financial reality," she said calmly. "And contribution matters." Ethan turned to me. "You never said you were documenting all of this." I met his gaze steadily. "You never asked." His attorney cleared his throat. "My client believes there was an understanding and implied agreement that the home was shared marital property. That belief," my attorney replied, "is not supported by documentation." She slid a folder across the table. Ethan reached for it, then hesitated. His hands hovered, as if touching the truth might burn. When he finally opened it, his face changed again. Not panic this time, something closer to disbelief. "You signed this without telling me?" he asked. "I signed it," I said, "because my name was the only one legally tied to the mortgage, because I paid for it, because I was advised to protect myself." "You planned this," he said again, his voice low. "No," I corrected him. "I prepared for reality." The discussion continued for hours. Every argument he tried to make circled back to the same dead end. Assumptions without proof, intentions without action, confidence without foundation. At one point, Ethan leaned forward, his frustration breaking through the polished exterior he'd worked so hard to maintain. "So, what now?" he asked sharply. "You walk away with everything?" "I walk away with what I paid for," I said. "There's a difference," he scoffed. "You think the court will see it that way?" My attorney answered before I could. "The court already does." That was the moment something inside Ethan fractured. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet realization settling behind his eyes. For 5 years, he had believed he was waiting me out. That my exhaustion would make me careless, that my trust would make me predictable, that the law would default to fairness in a way that favored him. He hadn't counted on preparation. He hadn't counted on me. The meeting ended without resolution, but the direction was clear. Ethan stood up abruptly, muttered something about needing air, and left the room. His attorney lingered behind, avoiding eye contact. "I'll be in touch," he said quietly. As the door closed, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "You did well," my attorney said. "This part is never easy." "It wasn't," I replied, "but it was necessary." Outside, the sky was overcast. The world looked muted, like the saturation had been turned down. I sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine, letting the reality sink in. I wasn't powerless. I never had been. That night, Ethan didn't come home. I assumed he stayed with a friend, or maybe a hotel. It didn't matter anymore. The house felt different without his presence, not emptier, just quieter. Like a space finally allowed to exhale. The calls stopped. Instead, emails came, carefully worded, strategically apologetic. "I never meant to hurt you. We can still resolve this peacefully. Let's not let lawyers destroy what we had." I read them without responding. Because what we had was already gone. What replaced it was clarity. Over the next few weeks, the process moved forward. Disclosures, negotiations, boundaries drawn in ink instead of hope. Ethan's tone softened noticeably. The confidence drained away, replaced by caution. At one point during another meeting, he tried a different approach. I supported you, he said quietly. I was there. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something unexpected. Not anger, pity. You watched me, I said. That's not the same thing. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. There was nothing left to argue. When the preliminary settlement was drafted, the terms were clear. I retained ownership of the house. My financial contributions were acknowledged. The narrative he had built of shared sacrifice and equal footing collapsed under the weight of facts. He signed without looking at me. Afterward, as we stood in the hallway, he finally spoke without strategy. I didn't think it would end like this, he said. I nodded. Neither did I. But unlike him, I wasn't afraid of that ending. Because endings, I had learned, aren't failures, they're revelations. That night, I walked through the house slowly, room by room. I touched the walls I had painted, the floors I had paid for, the space I had earned. For the first time since we moved in, the house felt like mine, not legally, but emotionally. I wasn't defined by the marriage anymore. I wasn't carrying someone else's expectations. I wasn't waiting for permission to rest. I slept deeply that night. No calls, no messages, no vibration jolting me awake, just silence. And in that silence, something new began to form. Not revenge, not bitterness, but resolve. I didn't win because I outplayed him. I won because I stopped assuming love required self-erasure. Because I learned that protection isn't cold or cruel, it's necessary. And because the law, when understood and respected, can become a shield instead of a threat. The house was paid off. But more importantly, so was the debt I owed myself. The house was quiet in a way I had never experienced before. Not the tense quiet of unspoken arguments or the careful silence that followed disappointment, but a clean, open stillness, the kind that allows you to hear your own thoughts without interruption. For the first few days after the settlement documents were signed, I moved through the house like a guest. I expected guilt to catch up with me. Or doubt. Or some delayed emotional collapse. Instead, what I felt was something simpler and heavier at the same time. Exhaustion. Not the kind that sleep fixes, but the kind that settles into your bones after years of vigilance. I took time off work for the first time in 5 years. Real time. Not a long weekend disguised as recovery. I turned off my alarms. Let the sunlight decide when I woke up. I cooked meals slowly instead of grabbing whatever was fast and efficient. Friends I had drifted away from began reaching out when they heard what had happened. Some apologized for not noticing how much I had been carrying. Others simply listened, which turned out to be more valuable than advice. I didn't tell the story all at once. I told it in pieces, because even now, I was still learning how to separate facts from feelings. One afternoon, I sat on the living room floor surrounded by paperwork, old budgets, calendars, notes scribbled in margins. Evidence of a version of myself who believed endurance was the same as love. I realized something uncomfortable. I had been proud of how much I could carry. That pride had kept me quiet longer than I should have been. Therapy wasn't something I had planned for. It was something my attorney suggested casually, the way someone suggests stretching after a long injury. You've been in survival mode for years, she said. That doesn't turn off automatically. She was right. In therapy, I talked about work, about money, about control, about how being competent had become my armor, how I measured my worth in productivity, how rest felt undeserved unless it was earned. We talked about Ethan, but not in the way people expect. Not about anger or blame, mostly about patterns. How charm can coexist with entitlement. How silence can be a form of agreement if it's never challenged. You didn't fail, my therapist said once. You adapted to survive. That sentence loosened something inside me. At home, I started reclaiming space in small ways. I moved furniture, painted over colors Ethan had chosen because they were neutral. I donated items I had never liked but tolerated to keep the peace. The house began to reflect me, not the version of me that worked 80 hours a week, but the one that had existed quietly underneath all along. Work changed too. When I returned, I declined overtime for the first time. I watched my manager's eyebrows lift in surprise. I'm prioritizing balance, I said simply. The world didn't collapse. In fact, nothing bad happened at all. That realization was both freeing and unsettling. I had sacrificed so much for a future that might have existed even if I had rested more, trusted myself sooner, Set boundaries earlier. Ethan reached out once more during that time. A single message. I hope you're okay. I stared at it for a long moment before deleting it. I was more than okay. I was learning who I was without being needed for someone else's comfort. Some nights, the grief arrived unexpectedly. Not for the marriage itself, but for the version of me who believed love meant proving your value through sacrifice. I let those moments come and go without judgment. Healing, I learned, isn't linear. It's quiet, repetitive, ordinary. One morning, I sat on the back steps with a cup of coffee and realized I hadn't checked my bank account in days. Not because I was avoiding it, but because I didn't need to. For the first time in years, my life wasn't organized around debt, deadlines, or damage control. It was organized around choice. I started setting new goals, but they felt different. Softer, more personal, less about survival and more about meaning. Travel, learning something new, rest without guilt. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. The house no longer felt like a trophy or a battleground. It was just a place, safe, stable, quiet, and that was enough. I had spent years believing strength meant carrying everything alone. What I was learning now was that strength can also mean stopping, letting go, choosing yourself without apology. The mortgage was paid off, the marriage was over, but my life wasn't diminished by that ending. It was widened. People like to believe betrayal comes with warning signs. That there's always a moment you can point to and say, that's when I should have known. The truth is quieter than that. Betrayal often hides behind normalcy, behind shared routines, behind the assumption that love automatically equals fairness. In the weeks after everything settled, I started receiving messages from women I barely knew. Friends of friends, coworkers' sisters. Some had heard pieces of my story, others just knew I had been through something. They all asked the same question in different ways. How did you survive it? At first, I didn't know how to answer. Survival felt accidental, not heroic. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I didn't survive because I was stronger than anyone else. I survived because I learned. And I learned just in time. No one teaches you how important paperwork is when you're in love. No one tells you that understanding legal language isn't pessimistic, it's protective. That asking questions doesn't mean you expect the worst. It means you respect yourself enough to be prepared. I had trusted Ethan with everything because I thought trust meant silence. Compliance. Not rocking the boat. What I learned was that real partnership can withstand clarity. If someone feels threatened by transparency, that's not love, it's leverage. Looking back, the law didn't save me. Knowledge did. Knowing what my name meant on a document. Knowing my rights before someone tried to reinterpret them. Knowing when to stop explaining myself and start listening carefully. I used to think legal conversations were cold, unromantic, something people only needed when things went wrong. Now, I understand they are simply another language. One that speaks when emotions are manipulated and words are twisted. When I met with my attorney, she never raised her voice. Never promised revenge. She focused on facts, on boundaries, on protecting my future, not punishing my past. That steadiness grounded me when everything else felt unstable. And it changed how I saw power. Power isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to intimidate. Power is knowing where you stand when someone else is trying to push you off balance. I began to notice how often women are encouraged to be agreeable instead of informed. To keep the peace instead of keeping records. To assume fairness instead of verifying it. I stopped doing that. Not just in relationships, but everywhere. At work, I started reading contracts instead of skimming them. Asking questions without apologizing for taking up space. Setting expectations instead of hoping people would intuit them. In friendships, I noticed who respected my boundaries and who benefited from me having none. Some connections faded, others deepened. I didn't become colder. I became clearer. There's a difference. One afternoon, months later, I ran into Ethan unexpectedly at a grocery store across town. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. He looked tired, uncertain, smaller somehow. I felt no satisfaction in that, no triumph. What I felt was distance. Emotional distance. The kind that means someone no longer has access to you. That, I realized, was freedom. Freedom isn't winning. It's no longer playing a game you never agreed to. If there's one thing I wish I could tell the version of myself from 5 years ago, it's this. Love does not require self-erasure. Partnership does not mean imbalance. And sacrifice without mutual respect is not noble, it's dangerous. I didn't lose my marriage because I worked too much. I lost it because I was the only one building something real. And I didn't rebuild my life by becoming harder. I rebuilt it by becoming informed, intentional, and finally on my own side. The house is quiet now, but it's not empty. It's filled with choice, with safety, with the understanding that I don't need permission to protect myself. That lesson cost me 5 years of exhaustion, but it gave me the rest of my life. For a long time, I thought this story ended the day the mortgage was paid off. That moment felt like the finish line, the proof that every sacrifice had been worth something. But now I understand that paying off the house wasn't the ending at all. It was the beginning. Not of a perfect life, not of instant happiness, but of a life where my effort finally belonged to me. I didn't rebuild overnight. Healing didn't come in a dramatic wave or a sudden sense of peace. It came in small, ordinary decisions, choosing rest without guilt, saying no without explanation, reading the fine print, trusting my instincts again. I learned that love should never require you to disappear to survive. That commitment doesn't mean endurance at any cost, and that partnership only works when responsibility, respect, and power move in both directions. I used to believe that being strong meant being indispensable, that if I carried enough, worked enough, sacrificed enough, I would earn security. What I know now is this. Security doesn't come from being needed. It comes from being valued and valuing yourself enough to walk away when that balance is broken. The law didn't punish my husband, it protected me, and that distinction matters. Protection isn't about revenge, it's about boundaries. About ensuring that no one can rewrite your contributions or erase your labor when it becomes inconvenient. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you're exhausted, if you're always the one holding things together, if your love is measured by how much you can tolerate, please hear this. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to protect yourself. Understanding your rights does not make you cynical. It makes you prepared. Setting boundaries does not make you selfish. It makes you safe. And choosing yourself does not mean you failed at love. Sometimes it means love failed to meet you where you stood. Today, my life is quieter. Not smaller, quieter. The kind of quiet that allows room for growth, joy, and possibility. I still believe in commitment. I still believe in partnership. But I no longer believe in sacrificing my entire self to prove my worth. If I ever love again, it will be as an equal. With clarity, with mutual respect, and with the understanding that strength doesn't come from how much you endure, it comes from knowing when enough is enough. The house is paid off. The past is settled. And for the first time in years, the future feels like mine. This story is a reminder that knowledge is not cold, it is compassionate. That preparation is not pessimism, it is self-respect. And that sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is stop carrying what was never meant to be theirs alone. If you take one thing from this, let it be this. Your time, your labor, and your well-being are worth protecting. Always.